Big news in real estate commissions. It may cost you more or it may cost you less to sell a house. Now that some big changes are coming, stay tuned, listen, find out what's going on, because this could be really important to you and it could impact the value of your home. I am Justin Miller with the Chong Miller Group. At the Chong Miller Group, we help people build wealth through real estate. We help people buy and sell homes in the Las Vegas Valley. So what am I talking about with regard to commissions? Well, let me give you just a little bit of background and we're going to dive right into this issue because it's really consequential. Okay, first of all, real estate agents tend to, like 98% of real estate agents, make their living by earning a commission or a small fraction of the proceeds on a sale of property. So an agent who represents a seller, a listing agent, gets to negotiate with that seller for a particular commission, an amount they'll earn based on the sale, the successful sale of that property. Well, buyer's agent, the person representing the buyer, same thing. They will negotiate a small commission for themselves, a small percentage of the actual transaction value. So let's say we were looking at a property of $1 million, and I'm going to make up numbers here for you. These numbers are meaningless, except they allow us to have a discussion with actual numbers in them. So these are not anything but examples. They're not indicative of what may be going on in the market at any particular point in time or in any geography. Let's say that the seller, the listing agent and the seller negotiate a 5% commission, and the property is listed at $1 million and actually sells at $1 million. That means the listing agent, or actually more correctly, the listing agent's broker, would be earning 5% on that $1 million or $50,000 on that successful sale. Now, there's another type of commission, and that's referred to as a co-op. The co-op, or cooperating agent commission, is that portion of the listing commission that gets paid to the buyer's agent. So the buyer may want to have an agent represent them in their transaction. It makes sense. This is a really big purchase that a buyer is making, and there are a lot of details that are extremely consequential, as well as agents have much more experience negotiating, especially within the particular market conditions that exist at a specific point in time and location, right? So a buyer may have experience having bought 5 houses before, but the market that they're working in to get a new house is very specific, and what they did 10 years ago in a different city may not matter whatsoever. So they hire a buyer's agent. They negotiate perhaps what that buyer's agent's going to make, and maybe the buyer's agent is going to ask to make 2%. And again, I'm making up these numbers. Well, the buyer could pay that buyer's agent, or the listing agent could offer the co-op, the cooperative commission, and that means that the listing agent, upon successful sale, their broker transfers to the buyer's agent's broker that portion which has been negotiated between the buyer's agent and the listing agent, that co-op, that cooperative commission, and that's what the buyer's agent earns. If that's sufficient to cover what the buyer has negotiated with the buyer's agent, great. If not, then the buyer is going to have to pay the residual to the buyer's agent. Okay, so that's been the way that real estate has been transacted in the US since the 1970s. We're talking 50 years. We're talking 2 generations of real estate sales. Well, for those of you who've been paying any attention to the news, you know that there have been several class action lawsuits filed over the past year and a half against the National Association of Realtors, NAR, as well as multiple brokerages and real estate agents, claiming that commissions have been fixed, they've been too high, they've been working a disservice to sellers. A jury verdict was reached in the first of these class action lawsuits earlier in actually late 2023, and NAR has been talking about appealing that. NAR has been trying to negotiate, and actually on March 15th of 2024, NAR just announced they've reached a global settlement in this issue and in all of these so-called copycat litigations that accuse NAR and their members of price fixing and of charging too much to sellers for their listings. Well, that's what I want to talk about, because this settlement agreement has a couple very interesting parts. Now, there's actually three major parts. There are minor details I'm not going to get into, but there's three major parts. These have to be approved by a court, by the court that heard the underlying case. As a settlement, if it's not approved, then the litigation continues, the potential appeal moves forward, etc. The first of those issues is NAR is going to have to pay $400+ million over a 4-year period of time to the litigants. That's actually the only part that requires approval from the underlying court. The other two parts could be executed by NAR irrespective of what a court does. So part one, NAR is now going to be requiring, as of July, that all buyers' agents must present to their buyer clients and get signed by their buyer clients the Buyer Brokerage Agreement. Now, it's called different things in different jurisdictions, but it's simply an agreement between a buyer and their representative agent stating that the buyer is hiring the buyer's brokerage and the agent for that particular brokerage to work on behalf of that buyer. It also says what the commission is that would be earned by the buyer's representatives, and it lays out details about how the broker, the agent, and the buyer are going to work together. Now, I've actually always required my clients, my buy-side clients, to sign a buyer-broker agreement with me. Best business practice. It helps to remove a lot of the potential misunderstandings that may arise within representation. It also helps to illuminate how things are going to be handled in a successful transaction. It's appropriate business structure to engage in real estate transactions. These should be in writing anyhow. So now NAR is going to require that for all members, they must get a buyer-broker agreement signed by the buyer, between the buyer and the agent, and actually the agent's broker, prior to representation, prior to showing any houses that are listed in any of the MLSs, the multiple listing service databases. In some states, this is already required. It will be required nationwide as of July of this year, 2024. That's best practice. It's good business structure. And again, NAR can implement this irrespective of whether a court agrees to the settlement or not, and frankly should be implementing this. There are some issues that attach to that, and we're going to talk about those in just a second. The third issue is more consequential. The third major portion of the settlement agreement reached between NAR and the litigants. And that is so it's easiest to think about it this way. When a listing agent takes a listing, they put that listing, that house that's for sale, into their local multiple listing service. That multiple listing service is a great big database that contains houses from every seller within the particular jurisdiction and details about those houses. The details would be price of house, address of house, square footage of house, number of bedrooms, number of garage bays, size of the lot, the type of roof, a whole lot of particular details. Some of those details may seem a little bit esoteric. Some of those details are really critically important to any buyer who happens to be looking for a house. And so agents have access to the multiple listing services. A buyer's agent might go into the MLS and search for the house that meets the buyer's criteria and then present to the buyer, hey, we've got these several we want to go take a look at. As well, over the past few years, Keller Williams listing service has gone and taken all of the information from the multiple listing services and aggregated that. Zillow has done the same thing. Realtor.com has done the same thing. And so regular people, non-licensed agents, have access to most of the MLS data that exists out there in the world in the US today. And that allows buyers to go and look for these properties as well. And so a buyer may call up the agent and say, I found these 3 properties on my own. I'd like to go take a look at them. Agent may then go into the MLS, the local MLS, and say, hey, these 3 look really good, except that this particular one, there's something you might want to watch out for, but I found another one that seems to meet your criteria. Maybe we want to delete the one that you had asked about and look at the other 2 as well as this other one I found for you, right? And go and look for things. Well, the great thing about any marketplace and about the MLSs is they allow for discovery of what's actually available for sale. They allow for discovery about the pricing on properties listed for sale and other criteria, the school district that property is in, how close it might be to a freeway or to a work environment. One of the data elements that has been historically located in the multiple listing service has been the co-op. It's one field, and the co-op field could say anything from 0 to some other percentage, or it could say a flat fee, and there could be a specific dollar amount issued. And so it's actually 3 highly interrelated data elements, and that is whether it's a commission based on percentage or a flat fee, it's what the percentage would be, and or it's what the flat fee would be for the commission. So the settlement agreement, as related to the information published in the MLSs, will eliminate those fields associated specifically with the co-op, which means that you will not be able to search through the MLSs any longer to see what a listing agent may be offering to a buyer's agent if there's a successful transaction. Now that seems very minor, right? It's literally the elimination of 3 small data elements from every listing in a database, of which there are literally over 100 data elements on every single listing. So eliminating 3 of them seems very minor, but this is going to have a massive impact on all buyer's agents. It's going to actually have a very big impact on all listing agents. It's going to have a very big impact on all buyers, and it's going to have a very big impact on all sellers. This is transformative and not necessarily in a good way to the real estate business. And so please pay attention to this. This is something you're going to have to think about. If you want to engage in real estate, you're going to want to talk to your agent about it, but you're going to have to think about this kind of strategically as well. It changes something really critically important. And it's not changing necessarily the way in which buyer's agents get paid. It's changing the information that exists around what buyer's agents are going to get paid. It actually reduces transparency in the potential for a transaction. Now, this is truly one of those cases of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There are people who've been claiming that they've been, as sellers, having to pay too much commission because they've had to pay their listing agent and they end up paying the buyer's agent, even though they're not working with the buyer's agent because they're the seller. And maybe the buyer's agent is working in some manner contrary to them because they're representing the other party to a transaction. They're representing the buyer. So interesting esoteric argument that actually doesn't make any sense. When you get right down to it, you need to have multiple parties to a real estate transaction. At the very least, you're going to need to have a seller and a buyer. And most times, because of the nature of the type of transaction, the size of it, the complexity of it, the very many real ways in which a transaction can go wrong and result in litigation, most times, sellers and buyers are each going to want to be represented, and the majority of time they're going to want to be represented by different entities, meaning they each want their own agent. Now, in some states, dual representation is permissible. That means that one agent could represent both the buyer and the seller. Even in those states where it is permissible, some brokerages will allow this and some brokerages will not allow this. And even in brokerages that allow their agents potentially to do dual representation, represent both parties on a transaction, many of those brokers will only allow certain experienced agents within their offices to engage in the dual representation, because there are both real benefits of dual representation, but there are complexities that can make a transaction more challenging and can lead to additional places where litigation can arise. And so dual representation exists. It's not actually super common. There are some agents where they actually may engage in a practice, a particular type of business activity where they're engaging in dual representation more frequently. But even with them, it's not the general way in which real estate transactions occur. Usually it's buyer and seller each have their own agent. Okay, so we eliminate then the ability, we eliminate the transparency for a buyer's agent to look at the multiple listing service and understand how much they'll be paid. Remember, if they've signed a buyer broker agreement, which had not generally been required until this July, they'll know what their buyer is supposed to pay them. But anything that they get through a co-op relieves a buyer of the responsibility for that amount of their payment. So if they've negotiated 7% from their buyer and the co-op were 3%, the buyer would be on the hook for 4%. If they don't know what the co-op is prospectively, then they're blindly showing properties. And here's where the problem arises. What happens if I, as a buyer's agent, am asked by a buyer to see a set of properties, and I've had them sign a buyer broker agreement, and that buyer broker agreement says they're going to pay me 5% of a transaction. And I look in the multiple listing service and I see here's 7 interesting properties, and my buyer and I confer, and we decide we're going to go look at 2 of them. And we take a trip out and we look at 2 of those properties. And let's just again assume they're $1 million properties. And we look at them and my buyer loves one of those properties. So he offers $1 million. Well, I then talk to the listing agent and I find out there's no co-op being offered. So my buyer client has to come up with $1 million for the purchase, has to come up with their share of closing costs, which usually amount to 1 to 1.5%. So let's just say $15,000 in this example. And they have to come up with my commission, $50,000, because we negotiated 5%. So they've got to come up with $1,065,000. Now, had they liked the other house, I call up that listing agent, and that listing agent says, yes, we're offering a co-op. The co-op is 5%. Well, my buyer would be able to put in the $1 million offer. My buyer would pay the $15,000 in closing costs that would be generally about the 1.5%. But my buyer would not have to pay anything on commissions. So they would get this other house for $1,015,000. Well, that's fine. Different houses have different prices. It's not so fine to me as a buyer's agent because it's hard for me to be able to advise prospectively about this critical issue and the difference of these 2 houses because it's no longer published. It's how I'm going to get paid as the buyer's agent. Now, there's a couple of other important issues here, and that is most buyers don't actually show up with tons of cash. Most buyers, actually something about 3/4 of buyers, it's literally between 70 and 75% of the market most of all of the time, are buying properties with mortgages, which means they're going to put in a down payment. Down payments could be whatever size, 3.5% to 20%, maybe larger with some buyers. Maybe smaller if you're a VA buyer, you could put in 0%, or a USDA buyer, put in 0%. But you're putting in some amount of money, and we know that down payments are often one of the gating factors for what buyers can buy. They have only so much money to put in for a down payment. So my buyer with the $1 million budget comes to me and says, I want to buy a house, I want to put 10% down, and that's basically all the money that I have that I can put into this transaction. So I'm going to put $100,000, I'm going to put $100,000 into this transaction. I say, well, we've got this buyer broker agreement, and you're going to owe me 5%. You're going to owe me $50,000 of commission. And the buyer says, well, I'm not going to have that money. So where am I going to get that money? Well, you could get that money from the co-op, from a listing. So a seller agrees to pay that. But what you cannot do is you cannot borrow that money, because banks do not lend money for commissions. They only lend money for the purchase of a home. And even then, only up to the agreed on percentage, subject to an appraisal. If the appraisal comes in at $900,000 and you had agreed on your loan application to put in 10%, the bank is not going to say, well, here's some extra money. The bank's going to say, all right, we'll give you now 90%, right? Your 10% down payment. We'll give you 90% of the $900,000. We will lend you $810,000. Even though initially you were thinking you were buying $1 million house and they were going to lend you $900,000, that was 90% of the contract price, but they'll only go up to 90% of the appraised price. So now you have an issue. We've got to go back and negotiate with the seller. Hey, wait, we've got a miss on the appraisal. What's going to happen here? So now buyer puts in 10% of $900,000, they put in $90,000. Maybe that frees up $10,000 of cash, but that's not sufficient to pay their agent their 5% commission. So before I get to the crux of the matter, let me tell you one other thing. I know it's become very common for all of us to watch so-called reality TV. And reality TV is like fake news. It's anything but real, right? We don't in reality have groups of people on an island trying to survive and voting each other off. We don't have groups of people living in a house that has thousands of webcams around broadcasting, their every move and interaction. Well, some of that reality TV, like on HGTV and Bravo and undoubtedly other channels, $1 million listing LA, selling Sunset, etc. We've kind of become accustomed to the idea that real estate agents, there's a listing and they might make $800,000 in commission. That's not real. And real estate agents, I guess, are very catty. They're always yelling at each other, but they're also going out and having little champagne things with each other all the time. Those are not real. According to NAR, the average real estate agent, not the top performing, not the bottom performing, the average real estate agent, sort of middle of the pack, does 3 transactions per year. The median home sale price across the US is a little under $400,000. So if we were to take a commission rate of, let's say, 3%, and let's say it's a $400,000 property, that's $12,000. You do 3 of them a year, you're making $36,000. But you're not really, because you've got a lot of additional costs that are coming out of that money. That's what the average real estate agent is doing. Now, what about here in Las Vegas? We've got well over 20,000 real estate agents who are members of the local Realtor Association here in the Las Vegas Valley. We have a number of transactions that take place every year. In fact, last year, we had the lowest number of transactions that have taken place since 2012. About 22,000 transactions. So we take that number of agents, we divide that into the number of transactions. Now multiply the transactions by 2 because we've got buyer and seller on each of those transactions. We've got about 44,000 transactions, 20,000 agents. Every real estate agent on average in the Las Vegas Valley in 2023 did just over 2 transactions. Median sale price last year, just over $400,000. Commission, actually a little under 3% if we sort of average across all of the commissions that were paid last year. So that means the average real estate agent was pulling in less than $8,000 in income last year here in the Las Vegas Valley. That's obviously not a living wage. It's not something people can live on. And there's actually strong divergence across agents. Some are very successful doing lots of transactions or on higher priced properties, some less so. Some real estate agents are literally making nothing. They're working at Starbucks and they're working at the casino and whatever to make their money, and maybe they just do 1 transaction a year, and that's for friends and families. That's not much. Real estate agents don't actually make all that much money, even though the reality TV shows indicate that real estate agents do. Okay, so having said that, let's get to the crux of the problem. We no longer will be able to advertise on a listing in the multiple listing service what the co-op is. And of course, buyer's agents are going to have to get the buyer brokerage agreement signed by their clients. That means their clients, buyers, rightfully understand the transaction is going to cost the buyer money. The real estate agent works and earns a commission, which they work hard to get. And they're going to be liable for paying that commission unless a seller decides to pay a co-op. A buyer's agent, it's going to become incumbent on the buyer's agent to make sure what the actual budget dollars are, cash budget dollars are, for any buyer that they're representing, so that they understand what can and cannot be productively shown. Then every buyer's agent is going to have to make a phone call or send a text and hope for a response to every single listing that they want to show and ask the listing agent, hey, is there a co-op, and how big is the co-op? And every time a listing agent says, there's no co-op on this one, the buyer's agent's going to say, well, is it something that could be negotiated, because otherwise I cannot show your listing to my client because my client cannot afford to pay the commission. Because most buyers are not going to have the extra money in their pocket to pay the commission. Listing agent says yes or no. Assuming they say no, or they say, well, there's maybe a little bit, but it's going to be, like 1/2 of 1%. Buyer's agent's going to say, I literally cannot afford to show your property. Sorry, I'm moving on to the next one. Move on to the next one. A seller says, a listing agent says on behalf of the seller, yes, we are offering a co-op. I'm so glad you called to ask that question. We're offering a co-op. It's going to be this much. And the buyer's agent says, great, I'd like to show your property. So price discovery becomes harder, right? Transparency has been reduced. More work is needed to be engaged in order to find out whether or not the co-op is even being paid, let alone what the value of the co-op is. That's going to reduce the number of buyers who look at anything for sale. And it's going to reduce the number of buyers who are qualified to buy anything for sale. Either sellers and their listing agents are going to have to negotiate. You got to pay a co-op, even if it's not advertised. It's going to have to be at this size. Otherwise, you're highly restricting the buyer pool. And some sellers will say, oh, I don't want to overpay. I want to be really careful here. I don't want to pay anything to the buyer's agent. Seller who does that is harming themselves. It's the economics of the situation. It's not agents trying to cheat a seller. It's literally buyer's agents cannot work for free, and many buyers cannot afford to reach into their pocket to pay the commission to their agent. This is really important to think about. So price discovery has been made harder because transparency has been removed. It's going to result in more work on behalf of buyer's agents to try to uncover this particular information. It's going to be done before any showings, which is going to reduce the number of showings on any particular property. So let me just ask you this. If you're thinking about selling a property, would you rather have placed your listing with an agent who says, I'm only going to advertise to the people that I know personally? Or choice B, they're only going to advertise to all of the clients who happen to be associated with other agents in their brokerage. Or choice C, they're going to advertise to everyone who looks in the multiple listing service and the derivatives of the multiple listing service throughout the entire locality. Well, if you chose choice A, just the agent's individual clients, you're looking at a very narrow group of people. Maybe 1, maybe 10, maybe the agent who's taking your listing knows a lot of people. Maybe they've got 20 people who are currently actively looking for something to buy in your price range in your neighborhood. So you're only marketing to 20 people. If you said to the brokerage, choice B, maybe you're marketing to 100 or 300 people. If you said choice C to the whole MLS, you're marketing to thousands of people. Which of those pools is more likely to bring you a buyer? Which of those pools is more likely to get you competition among buyers? And consequently, which of those pools is more likely to bring you multiple offers where those buyers are competing against each other to hold your price up? Now, this isn't identically the same, but to the extent that we reduce the number of buyers who can even look at a property, because we do something with the availability of co-op and the availability of information around a co-op, we're restricting the pool of buyers. And when we restrict the pool of buyers, fewer buyers show up and look, fewer buyers show up and make an offer, there's less competition on a property, prices don't go up, instead they may be going down. With this change, this throwing the baby out with the bathwater change, we're going to slow transactions in the market. We're going to make the transactions actually harder to engage in. And we're potentially going to be moving prices down because sellers are still going to want to sell their properties, presumably. So this one little change, very incredibly consequential. It's going to take several years to work this change through the system to reach a new stabilized point. And of course, between now and July, we'll see lots of little innovations. But the settlement agreement says specifically these fields are eliminated, removing price discovery from the multiple listing service around what buyer's agents can earn. And it's no longer going to be advertised. So this is actually a really big change in the market, even though it seems like a very technical little feature. Be prepared. This is going to slow down transaction volume and probably undercut pricing for a lot of us here in the Valley. I am Justin Miller with the Chong Miller Group. I will see you in the next video.